If you don't mind, I'd like to just set up the basics a little bit. Let's start with overdoses. So 2021 was a record year for overdose deaths. We are over 100,000 in this country. So far, 2022 shows indications of eclipsing those grim numbers. What is going on? What's driving the crisis, and why particularly now are we seeing such a precipitous rise?
Well, I can jump in, and I think that we would all respond in the same way. There are two major factors that are driving this. One of them has to do with the COVID pandemic, which has exacerbated the vulnerabilities of individuals and communities, which makes them more prone to take drugs. And clearly, that includes, for example, the closing of support systems that existed, for example, to provide with treatment to individuals with substance use disorder, including emergency departments. So those support systems, the loss of jobs, the isolation, all of those are factors that increase stress. And we know that increasing stress drives drug taking. But at the same time, there is another element that has played an important role, and is that during the COVID pandemic, we have seen an acceleration of the distribution of fentanyl throughout all of the country that was limited in the Northeast, and now it's absolutely everywhere. That was limited to used to contaminate heroin, and now it's used to contaminate everything. And the most recent development is the bringing of illicit fentanyl in illicitly manufactured prescription pills is now opening up the gate to making people that in the past would have not been at risk for having an overdose, and now are clearly very much at the chance of overdosing if they purchase an illicit pill, whether it is a stimulant, what they think is a stimulant medication like Adderall, or a benzodiazepine medication they think that it is to help them sleep, or even a pain analgesic. So those are two major factors. But within each one of them, of course, there are specifics. But this is overall what I would say is driving the really high numbers that we are seeing.
Well, and let's try to unpack that then a little more. Look, fentanyl, I think it goes through a normal development process and is just a prescribed drug. But it is my sense, the first I ever heard of it, maybe most people ever heard of it, was 2016 when Prince died of an overdose. Is it largely a matter of the illicit fabrication and distribution of it, or as with, say, OxyContin, largely a matter of abuse of the existent prescription and pharmacological system? Do we have a sense of that? And if I can add to this, why do we go from 1990 to around 2016, 2017 with fentanyl as a footnote, and now all of a sudden I believe it's involved in something like 2/3 of these 100,000 plus drug overdoses annually?
So fentanyl is the deaths are coming entirely from the illicit supply of fentanyl. There's nothing wrong with fentanyl. It was invented by a Janssen about 60 years ago. It's actually incredibly useful when used medically for things like controlling pain and late stage cancer. It's used in surgeries and anesthesia. But in those settings, it's going to be precisely measured out at a very, very small dose. And in that case, it's useful. In an illicit market, it's of wildly varying potency, and the person taking it, of course, it's not being prescribed to them by a physician. They don't know what they're necessarily taking.
Yeah, do they think they're even taking fentanyl?
Well, that's a really good question, to the extent to which people know what it is they're taking. At this point, if you're in an East Coast heroin market, you probably do know, because virtually every heroin that is seized has fentanyl in it. But for people who are using other types of drugs, like the ones Nora just mentioned, like pressed pills that look exactly like prescription pills, and you think it's an Ativan, that can be fentanyl and you don't know it. And that is why we've had, like out here, we've had a number of deaths of kids, teenagers, and college kids. And the reason that's happening is, if you've used heroin for a very long time, you do have a certain amount of tolerance to opioids. If you've never used opioids and you take what you think is an Ativan and you take fentanyl instead, you have no tolerance to that, and your risk of overdose is extremely high. And that's the diabolical nature of the market. One other thing that people may wonder is why do traffickers make fentanyl at all, given that it kills people? Why would you want to kill your customers? It's because the profit margin is simply spectacular. So with heroin, you have to have a farm somewhere. You're probably overseen by a dodgy warlord in a part of the world with weak governance. And then you have to process that plant product, opioid poppy, and ship it, 7,000, 15,000 miles, getting it past all these border posts, worrying about interdiction. Whereas fentanyl, you can just whip it up. A single chemist can whip it up in a sink, including very close to the final market source. So the profit margin for a trafficker is about 100-fold higher than it is for heroin. And if you're making that much money per sale, as cold as this sounds, you can actually afford to kill some of your customers, and you'll still come out financially ahead. Fentanyl is not something that users demanded. It's something that supply side did because it's extraordinarily lucrative.